1056 amends Idaho Code 46802 by the addition of a new section. The new section of code drops the prohibition on a body of men associating together as a military organization or a body of men parading in public with firearms. The new section of code also repeals the list of who may parade in public with firearms. Under Senate Bill 1056, students in educational institutions where military science is taught will no longer need the consent of the governor to drill and parade with firearms in public. Mr. President, with your permission, I'd like to briefly read from the United States Constitution.
Having identified the source, Senator is recognized to read.
First Amendment of the United States Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Senate Bill 1056 supports the constitutional rights of all Idahoans to freedom of assembly and the right to keep and bear arms. It also supports Article 1, Sections 9, 10, and 11 of Idaho's Constitution. Freedom of assembly is a right that is not predicated on a citizen's agreement to refrain from carrying firearms. And the constitutional right to freedom of assembly applies to all citizens, regardless of with whom they may affiliate, the purpose of the affiliation, or the title or name under which that affiliation exists. Idaho is a constitutional carry state. Many Idahoans carry firearms every day at work, when traveling, and generally when in public. Idahoans overwhelmingly conduct themselves safely, intelligently, and in compliance with applicable laws when carrying firearms. And yes, even if they belong to some form of militia group, and even when marching in parades. This legislation does not take a stance on the militia issue per se, even though armed citizen groups go back to the days of George Washington and his professed concept of having many small private militias for national defense, a concept that exists today in the form of community watch groups, private militias, and volunteer augmentees to aid law enforcement in times of emergency. This legislation also does not relieve any citizen of full compliance with existing gun laws or any other laws defining acceptable behavior and good citizenship. The fact is, at times, ordinary law-abiding armed citizens of our state do organize and present in public to stand in defense of their community. A good example of this took place in Lewiston, Idaho, when BLM arrived to demonstrate. That right of Black Lives Matter to demonstrate is protected by the First Amendment. The same First Amendment that protected the rights of the citizens of Lewiston to peaceably assemble. We will unfortunately always have those among us who will break the law and seek to cause unrest. However, the response to that should be one of due process. Our response should not be based in fear that leads to the abridgment of constitutional rights. I've spoken with numerous county law enforcement officers in my district, and they value the First and Second Amendment rights as supported in this legislation. They had no concerns with this bill. This legislation was reviewed by the Idaho Attorney General's office, and they saw no state or federal constitutional areas of concern. This rewrite of existing Idaho Code 46802, first enacted in 1927, brings it into recognition of and alignment with the First and Second Amendments of the Constitution of the United States. It is a sensible change to code that recognizes the rights, desires, and lawful actions of our citizens. Mr. President, debate is open.
Debate being open, is there further debate?
Mr. President.
Senator Groh.
A question, if I may, for the sponsor.
Senator Foreman, will you yield?
I yield.
State your question.
Thank you, Mr. President. We had a problem here in Idaho with towns or cities forming militia.
Mr. President,
Senator Foreman?
good senator from 14, not to my knowledge. I left that portion of the original code in my bill at the request, very logical request of a fellow senator, and it simply says what it says. I agree with it. I don't think our community should be spending tax dollars along those lines, and so we left that in. The rest of the original code has been taken out.
Thank you, Mr. President. For a follow-up?
I'll yield, Mr. President.
State your question.
Thank you. So we haven't had a problem, but your concern is that we may have a problem in the future?
Senator Foreman?
Mr. President, good senator from 14, I wouldn't say I have a concern. Again, I left that part of the original code in for the reasons I stated. My concern is we have a constitution with a First and Second Amendment, and it was clear to me that the original code violated the First and Second Amendment. So that was the intent behind the rewrite.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Is there further debate?
Mr. President.
Senator Reckney?
Mr. President, to debate against the bill.
Floor is yours.
Senators, this bill does two things. Number one, it removes Idaho's prohibition against militias. Number two, it allows, against private militias. Number two, it allows private militias or any group to show up in your community in a parade with weapons. AK-47s, you imagine the weapon, they can show up and march in your community under arms. That's what this bill does, because it eliminates language in Idaho Code Section 46-802 that currently prohibits both of those things. So let's start with private militias. Now, you may hear people say that there are other laws that will deal with this. There are not. There are other laws in our criminal statutes that once the problem gets out of hand, once the private militia starts taking actions, overthrowing governments, taking over buildings, doing other activities as a private militia, then the law steps in, but by then it's too late. If we vote for this bill, Idaho law will no longer have a policy that states you cannot get together as a private militia. You cannot gather as a private militia. And those laws have been upheld again and again and again under the First Amendment. You do not have a right to be part of a private militia in the state of Idaho or any other state in the United States. Again, this bill will eliminate Idaho's prohibition against militias, and for that reason, I'd ask you to vote against the bill. The second thing this bill does is it allows groups to march under arms in parades in your local communities with weapons of their choice. Now, if we could pick what groups got to do that, I think all of us probably could come to some agreement and be quite comfortable with that. But that's not the way this works. Every group gets to take advantage of that opportunity. We know that because if you are my age or a little older, you remember what it was like when in Coeur d'Alene every year the Aryan Nations would show up and have their parade. And every year national press would show up and cover it. Around the time that was happening, I was over in Europe in the military. And there were really two things that other soldiers knew about Idaho when I'd tell them where I was from. They'd say one of two things. One, they'd say potatoes, and you'd say, yes, that is, an important vegetable in our state. But the second thing they would always say is, don't you have Aryan Nations or don't you have white supremacists in Idaho? We had a reputation for hate. Now, I didn't think it was fair because I knew how people in Coeur d'Alene felt about it. They hated the fact. They hated the fact, as did most of us, that white supremacists could show up in their community and attract attention from the press and make it look like North Idaho was filled with people who tolerated tolerated that those attitudes and that way of life. But the First Amendment allows everybody to take advantage of it, even if you disagree with it. This bill does not propose a Second Amendment right. This is not a Second Amendment right to be able to gather in a parade as an organized group with weapons. That's not a Second Amendment right. It's a First Amendment right. And the question is, do you want to add weapons to a First Amendment right? Now think about that. White supremacists can show up in a parade in your hometown and they're allowed to do it. There's nothing you can do to stop it because that's part of being in a democracy in the United States. They have the right to assemble, they have the right to associate, they have the right to free speech. And if you don't like it, the Idaho Supreme Court, or excuse me, the United States Supreme Court has told us time and time again, what you get to do about it is use your own First Amendment rights. You get to show up at that same parade or do your own and protest against them. And I have to admit, even though it can make you uncomfortable, it kind of makes you proud as well. Whether it's somebody standing at a corner in town with signs shouting their message, facing off against opponents to their issue, whether it's gathering at a park with speeches trying to get people to come on board with what you believe, or whether it's in a parade, it makes you proud. But your right to fight against ideas you don't like is with your own First Amendment rights, and we trust that the marketplace of ideas will sort all that out. And in the end, the right idea will make it to the top. Now, add weapons to that discussion. Add weapons to those very heated arguments. It's not a Second Amendment right, it's just a bad idea. It's a bad idea for a number of reasons. One, it can get out of hand really easily. You can talk to police officers who have to deal with that. Number two, it starts to chill First Amendment rights. You show up to a parade, neo-Nazis are marching with weapons. Are you really going to express how you feel about them? You're at least going to think twice, maybe 3 times, maybe you won't even say anything. This bill is a problem. This bill allows private militias, Aryan Nations, White Supremacists, Patriot Front to show up in your communities. They have the right to do it under this bill because we've taken away the prohibition against it. I urge you to vote against this bill. Thank you.
Further debate.
Mr. President,
Senator Tracol.
to debate the bill.
Floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to point out that this country was built on the fact of our militias, and that this country takes great pride in the freedoms that citizens have and the opportunities. Now, listening to the good senators just talk, you would think that Idaho's full of hate groups and white supremacists and neo-Nazis. I ask all of you here, how many know a neo-Nazi, white supremacist hate group? Any individuals? So that being said, we don't create laws to prevent law-abiding citizens to carry or to do something. If that was the case, we'd outlaw driving because of how many people are speeders. All right. So I'd like to point out the fact that all this law does is open it up to deregulation from the government, allows individuals to carry in a parade. That's it. And that's what this country was founded on. So I ask you to vote in favor of this bill.
Thanks, Senator. Is there further debate?
Mr. President,
Senator Hart.
to debate in favor of the bill.
Floor is yours.
We love our right to free speech, and we need to be careful when we carve out exemptions to our right to free speech. We love our right to keep and bear arms, the Second Amendment. We need to be careful when we carve out exemptions to our right to keep and bear arms. There's an exemption carved out to that right now in Idaho Code. The good senator from 6 is removing that exemption. I think this is a good bill, and I support it.
Thanks, Senator. Is there further debate?
Mr. President.
Senator Wintrow.
Thank you, Mr. President. To debate against the bill.
Floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senators. I'd like to remind the body that this is not just about parades, it's about the verb parade, so that people can show up in groups assembling together with firearms, which is different. So I do think that this bill would open up an additional can of worms we haven't considered, and that would be for a group of people to be armed in whatever weapon they choose outside a judge's home, a commissioner's home, a school board, a legislature. And this bill would allow it. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled over and again that this is not a protected right. Certainly, to bear arms is. It's different for me to walk down the street with a firearm versus with 20 other people bearing those arms with an intent. And that's what this bill opens up. The proponents of the bill have indicated it does allow for private militias to form. I think we're getting more than we bargained for on this. I underscore the the senator from 29, and we need to learn from our history and not repeat it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Is there further debate?
Mr. President,
Senator Robbie,
to debate against the bill.
floor is yours.
I know senators already spoke against this, but I feel like this is really important, and I just want to add on to really clarify what this bill is doing in effect. In all fairness to the sponsor, it's a little bit confusing the way that it's drafted because it repeals an entire section of code and adds a new one. But what's taken away from here again is what will allow in effect for an armed militia to parade anywhere. There's no other section of code that prohibits that from happening, which is, for me, senators, honestly, a little bit alarming and scary. Further, there's no definition of parade in this section of code that's being added or elsewhere in our code. So this creates many problems, depending on how you define parade. So I grew up in Idaho, and my dad, as a hunter, he taught me gun safety. It's very important. And to carry a weapon in public in Idaho, you have to get extensive training on concealed or enhanced carry permits. So, to make sure that you don't accidentally, shoot anyone. This bill essentially allows anyone with a weapon, no matter if you have concealed carry or anything, to parade in public with absolutely no training or firearm safety. Again, it's very unclear what parade means. This bill also takes away the prohibition that cities have for law enforcement requiring, city permits for gathering. Cities are no longer going to be able to refuse a permit for armed bodies that are parading, marching, demonstrating, again, whatever that means with that unclear definition. It was mentioned by a senator from District 19. Parade could mean allowing folks to protest in front of libraries, hospitals, healthcare clinics, school board meetings, judges or other elected officials' homes. Could be paraded in front of, because again, this prohibition is revealed. The vagueness also creates a lot of challenges and is going to create costs for local governments or other governing bodies who are saying that they're going to have to increase their insurance risk management. So budgets can increase for school boards, city halls, Capitol, even in the Capitol, other government buildings, sheriff's offices, churches, synagogues. Again, it could put elected officials in danger should folks decide to parade in front of their homes. So the bill, the section of code that this repeals needs to either remain as is or simply be amended. Otherwise, we're putting our children and our community members in danger. And senators, as I'm about to bring a child into this state, I would certainly enjoy the freedom and feeling of safety in bringing him to parades. But I will not feel that safety should this pass, because again, any armed group can participate in those parades, putting our children in danger. This is a real threat. Western State Center estimates that over 25 paramilitary groups in Idaho are forming. There's another estimate from Southern Poverty Law Center that there are 19 growing groups in Idaho whose gatherings and threats have shown that they are ready to show up at these types of gatherings and put people in danger. Again, with no training, no requirements or support. So please, senators, vote against this bill.
Thank you, Senator. Is there further debate? Seeing none, Senator Foreman is recognized to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you to all the good senators for the spirited debate. You know, with respect to the negative comments about this bill, I heard the same things about concealed carry when it was being debated. And what happened after concealed carry became law? Crime went down. Violent crime, in particular against women and the elderly, went down.
Why are you so good, God?
Respect for the Constitution is the key. Respect for due process is the key. In this state, we prosecute people for violations of the law, not for what they might do, not for what we think their intentions might be. This is the United States. We have a Constitution. This is Idaho. Everyone gets to exercise his or her constitutional rights in this state. Yes, even the people with whose ideologies we disagree or find repugnant, they have the same constitutional rights to assemble, to carry firearms, and to parade, just like the rest of us do. My fellow senators, we should not legislate out of fear. We should not curtail constitutional rights out of fear or assumptions. Either everyone gets to exercise their constitutional rights, or we may live to see the day where none of us can. Mr. President, debate is closed.
Debate being closed, the question is, shall Senate Bill 1056 pass the Senate? Secretary will call the roll.
Adams. Anthon. Berndt. Bierke. Burtonshaw. Cook. Den Hartog. Dunn. Foreman. Grove. Guthrie. Harris. Hart. Hartkin. Herndon. Just. Lakey. Lee. Lenny. Lind. Nichols. Okonowitz. Robbie. Ricks. Ruchte. Schroeder. Semmelroth. Taylor. Taves. Trakel. Van Orden. Ordingle-King. Winder.
Aye.
Wintrow. Seiderveld. Berndt. Burtonshaw. Grove. Van Orden.
Roll call shows 24 ayes, 9 nays, 2 absent, excused. A majority have voted in the affirmative. Senate Bill 1156 has passed the Senate. It's for correction of the title. Hearing none, title's approved. Senate Bill 1056 retransmitted to the House.